Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Something the music industry has quietly swept under the purple carpet for decades. Prince, the genius, the icon, the legend, was 37 years old when he decided that a 16-year-old girl would become his wife. Not hoped. Not dreamed. Decided. And then he waited. 6 years of carefully orchestrated control, 6 years of molding and shaping, 6 years of ensuring that by the time Mayte Garcia was old enough to legally marry him, she had been so thoroughly transformed that she no longer knew where Prince's vision ended and her own identity began. The world called it romance. Those close to the situation whispered about something else entirely. And when their marriage produced a son with a fatal genetic condition, a baby who lived only 7 days, the way Prince responded to that tragedy revealed the true nature of their relationship in the most devastating way possible. This is the story that Prince's estate doesn't want told. This is the story Mayte struggled for years to tell. This is the story of how a teenage girl lost herself in the shadow of a legend and the unimaginable price she paid for being someone's obsession. If you want to discover the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe to our channel now. You won't want to miss what comes next. August 1990. Cologne, Germany. Backstage at a concert venue, 32-year-old Prince stood in the shadows watching a 16-year-old belly dancer rehearse. Mayte Garcia moved with hypnotic grace, unaware that her entire future was being decided by a man she hadn't even met. When her mother introduced them, Prince didn't offer pleasantries. He looked directly at Mayte's mother and said 5 words that would seal the teenager's fate: "She's going to be my wife." Not a compliment. A declaration of ownership over a girl still in high school. Mayte smiled nervously, thinking it was eccentric celebrity humor. Her mother laughed, flattered by the attention. Neither understood that Prince had just announced a 6-year psychological campaign to systematically erase Mayte's identity and replace it with his vision of the perfect woman. Within days, videotapes arrived, personal messages from Prince about destiny and soul connections. These weren't innocent mentor messages. They were calculated grooming moves, building dependency so that by marriage age, separation would feel impossible. To understand what happened to Mayte, you need to know about Prince's all-consuming rivalry with Michael Jackson. In 1987, Michael wanted Prince to duet on Bad. Prince listened to the demo and reportedly laughed, calling the song weak and refusing to participate. But the rejection went deeper than musical disagreement. Prince saw Michael as too calculated, too sanitized, too controlled by the industry. In contrast, Prince styled himself as the authentic genius who answered to nobody, whose sexuality and creativity were raw and uncontained. After rejecting Bad, Prince became obsessed with proving he was more talented, more authentic, and more powerful than Michael Jackson in every way. And part of that proof, twisted as it sounds, involved his relationships with beautiful young women. If Michael was the Peter Pan figure who seemed uncomfortable with adult sexuality, Prince would be the hypersexual genius who attracted the most stunning women in the world. Mayte Garcia, exotic and talented and young enough to be completely molded, became part of Prince's psychological competition with his rival. She wasn't just a person he loved. She was evidence of his power, his magnetism, his superiority. Those close to Prince during this period described his possessiveness over Mayte in almost competitive terms, as if she were a trophy proving his dominance over every other man in the industry, especially Michael Jackson. At 17, Prince offered Mayte a dream: join his band, move to Minneapolis, live at Paisley Park. For a teenage Puerto Rican dancer, this seemed like destiny. Her starstruck mother helped her pack. Within weeks, Mayte was living inside the 55,000-square-foot complex that was Prince's personal kingdom. On the surface, Paisley Park was creative paradise. But for young women romantically involved with Prince or being groomed for that role, it was something else entirely: a controlled environment where Prince's preferences became absolute law, where the outside world faded away, where your existence revolved around one man's vision. Former employees described an almost cult-like atmosphere. Prince controlled what people ate, everyone followed his strict vegetarian diet. He controlled when they slept, his erratic 3 a.m. work schedule meant constant availability. He controlled appearance, presentation, and social contacts. For Mayte at 17, these controls were invasive and absolute. Her closet held only Prince-selected clothes. Her meals followed his dietary philosophy. Her entire schedule revolved around his needs. For Mayte, arriving so young before her adult identity formed, normal late adolescence experiences were completely absent. She learned to suppress her wants so thoroughly that she couldn't remember her own preferences. Staff recalled watching her sit silently for hours, waiting for Prince's acknowledgement. Before Mayte, there was Madonna. In 1989, Prince and Madonna recorded together for her Like a Prayer album. Only Love Song was released, but insiders say they recorded enough material for an entire album. Madonna was 30, Prince 31, adults and equals professionally. But equality terrified Prince. Sources described the dynamic as intensely competitive and sexually charged. Prince tried controlling the creative direction, imposing his vision on Madonna's project. She pushed back, made her own decisions, refused to become another molded young woman. The recordings were allegedly so intimate and provocative that Madonna decided they were too revealing to release. But the real reason most material stayed vaulted was the power struggle becoming too intense. He couldn't control her, and that made him deeply uncomfortable. After Madonna, Prince's pattern shifted. He stopped pursuing established female artists and focused almost exclusively on younger, less experienced women, dancers, backup singers, aspiring performers financially dependent on him. Then came Mayte at 16, the ultimate control opportunity. By the mid-90s, as Prince's relationship with Mayte deepened toward marriage, he was simultaneously fighting his most public career battle, war with Warner Brothers Records. In 1993, Prince changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol and appeared with slave written on his face. He fought for master recording ownership, creative freedom, and release control without corporate interference. The battle was justified. Prince advocated for artist rights in an exploitative system, and his stance proved visionary. But nobody discussed how Prince's war with Warner Brothers affected people closest to him, particularly young women in his life. When someone fights an all-consuming professional battle, they often become more controlling in personal life, a psychological compensation mechanism. If you feel powerless in one arena, you assert dominance more aggressively in another. For Prince, Mayte bore the brunt of his frustration and control needs during years when his professional autonomy was under attack. Prince became increasingly volatile. Mayte navigated a relationship with a man fighting the music industry while maintaining absolute personal control. When she needed reassurance, she was shut out, told Prince's career battle was more important than her emotional needs. The Warner Brothers war taught Prince that asserting dominance was the solution to feeling powerless. It taught Mayte that her needs were always secondary to Prince's larger battles. And it created a dynamic where genuine emotional intimacy became impossible because vulnerability was interpreted as weakness. So when their marriage later faced its greatest test, the birth and death of their son, neither had the tools to navigate it. Prince could only try to control and deny. Mayte could only suppress and comply. Valentine's Day 1996. Prince and Mayte married. She was 22, he was 37. Photos show Mayte in a Prince-designed gown. Even on her wedding day, her appearance was his creation. Looking at those photos now, knowing what came after, you see a young woman who spent 6 years being molded, finally locked into a legal bond, making leaving even harder. But that day, Mayte believed she was living a dream. She'd been told for 6 years that being Prince's wife was her destiny, that their connection was cosmic and inevitable. She'd been isolated from perspectives that might have questioned the relationship or encouraged independence. She was marrying the only adult relationship she'd ever known, the man who defined her entire experience of love, sexuality, and self-worth since she was 16. Early marriage months followed the pattern. Prince's attentiveness functioned as surveillance. When Mayte showed independence, he became distant until she refocused entirely on him. She had no separate career, no financial independence, no social circle apart from Prince's world. This is coercive control's goal, making the victim's world so small that leaving feels impossible. Prince achieved this perfectly. Mayte wasn't just his wife. She was his creation, his possession, his proof of genius extending beyond music into human relationships. And she'd been trained so thoroughly to see this as love that she didn't recognize the cage. Within months of marriage, something happened that would test the fairy tale. Mayte became pregnant. For Prince, this was the completion of his vision, a wife molded to perfection, now carrying his child. He became intensely focused on the pregnancy, managing Mayte's prenatal care with the same controlling attention he applied to everything else. His Jehovah's Witness religious beliefs influenced which medical interventions he would allow, which tests could be performed. Mayte, trained to defer to Prince's judgment, trusted he knew best. That trust would have devastating consequences. October 16, 1996. After difficult labor, Mayte gave birth to a son, boy Gregory Nelson. But doctors' faces told a different story. Something was visibly wrong. Within hours, he was diagnosed with Pfeiffer's syndrome type 2, a rare severe genetic disorder. The prognosis was devastating. Children with this condition rarely survive infancy. Boy Gregory couldn't breathe without mechanical assistance. His small body fought a battle medicine couldn't win. For a man who'd spent his life bending reality to his will, this was incomprehensible. His son was dying, and no amount of talent or willpower would change that fact. For 7 days, Prince and Mayte kept vigil over their dying child. They held boy Gregory, talked to him, sang to him. But Pfeiffer's syndrome was stronger than prayer, stronger than love. On October 23, 1996, exactly 1 week after birth, boy Gregory died. When doctors pronounced him dead, something broke in both of them, but in completely different ways. Mayte felt grief. Prince felt intolerable control loss. And how each processed this tragedy would expose their relationship's true nature in the most devastating way possible. Within 48 hours of boy Gregory's death, Prince made a shocking decision. He refused to acknowledge it had happened. Not just publicly, which might be understandable as privacy, but privately as well. He instructed everyone at Paisley Park, staff, band members, friends, and Mayte herself, to stop talking about the baby, stop mentioning his name, proceed as if boy Gregory never existed. When Mayte tried processing her grief, tried discussing the trauma of carrying a baby 9 months, watching him suffer a week, then losing him, Prince shut down the conversation. He told her they needed moving forward, trusting God's plan, focusing on the future rather than dwelling on the past. But this wasn't healthy grief processing or spiritual acceptance. This was pathological denial, an attempt to exert control over reality itself by refusing to acknowledge parts challenging his worldview. Prince couldn't accept his son had died, so he simply decided the death hadn't happened, or didn't matter, or that talking about it was faith failure. And Mayte, conditioned 6 years to defer to Prince's judgment and suppress her own needs, tried desperately to comply with this impossible demand. Less than 3 weeks after burying her son, Mayte was back on stage with Prince, performing as if nothing changed. But behind the scenes, she was falling apart, severe depression, panic attacks. When friends tried offering support, Prince intervened. This victim isolation is classic abuse, cutting off support sources. Prince maintained total control over her environment, her therapy access, her grief processing. Nobody felt they could challenge Prince. He was the boss, the genius, the legend. The situation worsened. In 1997, roughly a year after boy Gregory's death, Mayte became pregnant again. This pregnancy was defined by anxiety from the start. Both were terrified the genetic condition would repeat, but Prince's religious beliefs still prevented comprehensive genetic testing. Mayte spent months in constant fear, her body carrying another baby while her mind still processed the first loss. Then, several months into pregnancy, the fear proved justified. Mayte suffered a miscarriage. Losing a second child, compounded by unprocessed grief from the first tragedy, was more than her psychological defenses could handle. Something fundamental broke in Mayte during those months. For years, she'd suppressed her own instincts, needs, and voice to be the woman Prince wanted. But grief this profound couldn't be suppressed. It demanded acknowledgement. It insisted on being felt. And Prince's response to the miscarriage was identical to his response to boy Gregory's death: move on, don't talk about it, focus on the future, trust God. But Mayte couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't pretend she was okay, couldn't perform happiness, couldn't continue erasing herself to maintain Prince's fantasy of perfect control. The second pregnancy loss was the moment psychological conditioning began cracking, when Mayte started glimpsing the reality of what had been done to her over 8 years. Prince withdrew further. He spent days in the studio without meaningful interaction. Friends described a ghost marriage, two people in separate emotional realities. Mayte was finally waking from the spell. By 1998, the marriage was over. When she left Paisley Park, she left with almost nothing. Mayte found herself in her mid-20s rebuilding life from scratch, carrying trauma of 2 lost pregnancies and 8 years of psychological control. The years following divorce were Mayte's hardest. She had to relearn basic things, making independent decisions, trusting her judgment. She struggled with severe depression and PTSD, bound by an NDA preventing public speech about her marriage. For years, she simply survived, feeling fundamentally broken. Mayte had to essentially re-raise herself. But Mayte's story doesn't end with victimhood. In 2017, a year after Prince's death, she made a life-changing decision. She published a memoir titled The Most Beautiful, My Life with Prince. The book was controversial from announcement. Prince's estate threatened legal action. Loyal fans accused her of betrayal, profiting from his death, making up stories for attention. Backlash was intense and sometimes vicious. But Mayte had spent nearly 2 decades finding her voice, learning to trust her own experience, and preparing to tell her story regardless of consequences. The memoir is notable for complexity and honesty. Mayte doesn't paint Prince as a cartoon villain. She acknowledges his genius, describes genuine connection moments, and admits she loved him despite everything. But she also names what happened: grooming, coercive control, psychological abuse disguised as romantic devotion. She describes the isolation, manipulation, and systematic identity erosion. She talks about Boy Gregory and the miscarriage with raw grief suppressed for 20 years. Most importantly, she describes the long recovery process, learning who Mayte Garcia actually was underneath the creation Prince had molded her into. In years since publishing her book, Mayte has become an advocate for young women in entertainment. She speaks about grooming warning signs and maintaining independent identity. PTSD from sustained psychological abuse doesn't disappear. She still has nightmares, still struggles trusting her judgment. But she's built a life that belongs to her and found purpose in speaking truth the music industry would prefer keeping hidden. When Prince died on April 21, 2016, the world mourned a musical legend. But Mayte Garcia processed very different grief. She mourned the man she'd married, but also the girl she'd been before meeting him, the 16-year-old with her own dreams. She mourned Boy Gregory in years consumed by someone else's vision. When asked for comment, she said, "I loved him deeply, and I grieve for the person he was to me. But I also grieve for the person I might have been if we had never met." This story should make us question romantic narratives that disguise grooming. Talent doesn't excuse harm. When we celebrate Prince's music, we must also hold space for truth about how he treated women in his life. Mayte paid an enormous price for being Prince's obsession. She lost her youth, her identity, her children, and years of her life to a relationship that was never equal or healthy. But she survived, recovered her voice, and chose to tell her story despite knowing the cost. That courage deserves recognition and respect. And her story deserves being heard, not as a footnote to Prince's legacy but as a crucial part of understanding who he really was and what the culture enabling him continues costing young women today. The Purple Fairy Tale had a dark underbelly most people never saw. Acknowledging that darkness doesn't diminish the music, it simply adds truth to the legend. And in the end, truth, however uncomfortable, is always more valuable than myth. Mayte Garcia spent her youth living inside someone else's fantasy. She spent her adulthood fighting to reclaim reality. Her story is a warning, a testimony, and ultimately a hope message, that even after years of control and manipulation, it's possible to find yourself again, to build a life on your own terms, and to transform pain into purpose by speaking truth that might help others avoid the same fate. The price of silence is steep. It costs women their voices, their autonomy, their very selves. But the power of truth, as Mayte has proven, can break even the strongest chains and light a path toward freedom for others still trapped in the darkness.